Hi, my name is D-Doc, and welcome back to my Jungian Typology series, where basically I attempt to teach Jungian Typology in the best way that I can. These are basically my class notes. I do not claim any expertise. This is basically a hobby of mine, and so I'm just trying to teach it to the best of my ability because I believe it can actually help people. So, today we're going to be talking about definitions, and here I have set up my computer, my screen, so that way it's easier for me to talk about what needs to be said. On the left side is Google Docs, where I kept all my notes, and on the right side I'm going to be drawing, illustrating my points, so that way we can follow along and I can elaborate more on each definition so that I'm not just reading off screen. I have a disclaimer before we go on to any of the definitions. Words that have an asterisk on them, these are not all official terminology. I just use them for myself to help express concepts better. Anyone is welcome to use or dismiss them, so long as we understand what I'm trying to communicate here. So that's my little disclaimer. I'll point it out. That way no one's confused. And they're not official. They're ones I made up to help myself. So, by the way, I did try to credit as many people as I can name off of the top of my head in my first video, which was over a year ago. So if I'm missing any credit, if you notice that I should credit someone, please let me know so that way I can do the proper crediting, because I do not want to, plagiarize. I want to give the proper credit because, like I said, I'm not an expert. This is my hobby. When I was originally writing my Google Docs, I had tried to link and add credit later on, but I forgot to do all of it. So hopefully you can forgive me. I'm not doing this on purpose. I'm not trying to steal. I've simply just forgot. It's been like over a year. Anyway, let's get started. Our first definition is cognitive function. Now, I realized in my first video I did not get to the point of what a cognitive function was, and that's really confusing because I was really only talking about problems I noticed within the community. But if you're outside the community and you don't know the lingo of the community, then basically you would have no idea what I was even talking about when I mentioned cognitive function or really anything in the video. So I'm going to go over this real quickly. The closest equivalent in Socionics is called an information metabolism element. Socionics, by the way, is another model within Jungian Typology. That's later on in the series. Don't worry about that. Cognitive functions are higher order mental operations that help us gather and process information. In the Jungian Typology theory, there are 4 base functions: sensing, intuition, thinking, and feeling, which then get divided via orientation, which is extroversion, introversion. I'll explain what that is in a moment, making 8 cognitive functions in total. Each function is responsible for handling certain kinds of information. So basically, these are all just things going on within your brain, the way how you're processing information. That's what a cognitive function is. It's just a name for different informations that you're processing. Hopefully that makes sense. Object. Now this is going into more the different kinds of cognitive functions and what kinds of information they deal with. So just hang in there. This will all make sense eventually. Object. A thing that can be perceived, can be judged, and is ultimately a separate entity from the subject. Typically a material thing that can be seen and touched, but can also be a mental thing. So, I do not like that angle. Alright. This is our object. It can be anything. Anything that can be perceived or judged. So it can be your phone, it can be your glasses, it can be you. If you're an object because you can be perceived and you can be judged. So it can be anything though. It's the opposite of a subject. Now, what's a subject? A subject is any person who can influence data with their subjective bias, which involves personal feelings, tastes, opinions, impressions of the object, etc. So, this is your subject. It's a person. And the reason why subjective bias is important is because the person is adding information onto the object. It's putting their own impressions onto an object. So everyone has subjective bias. So, even when you're trying to be objective, you still have subjective bias to a degree. But the way how this relates to cognitive functions is that some cognitive functions are more subjective, and some cognitive functions are more objective. Now, some people would disagree with me. They would say, well, cognitive functions are neither objective or subjective. I've heard this argument before. I'm not too knowledgeable as to why that is. From how I first learned the theory, I learned that some cognitive functions are more objective and some cognitive functions are more subjective. Alright, we're going on to our next definition now. Orientation, aka extroversion, introversion, EI, binary coin, or attitudes. The determination of the relative position of something or someone. So, this in Myers-Briggs is often understood as sociability, like, are you introvert or extrovert? Everyone has heard this. This is how we commonly understand extroverts and introverts. But when it comes to cognitive functions, we are not talking about this at all. This is completely different. Cognitive functions. So orientation for cognitive functions goes back to this idea of the object and the subject. So when we say an extrovert function, we mean the functions that take in more objective information. And by the way, originally extrovert was spelled with an A instead of an O. And I always spell an A whenever I'm talking about cognitive functions, so they just like keeping that tradition. Introverted functions are more subjective. We'll go over here to explain more of what that means. The objective outer world, or the empirical orientation towards the outside world, taking data as it is given at face value without the subject. A focus on the characteristics and behavior of objects outside the observer. Emphasizes the existence of the group in it of itself, without the categories. Grants more weight in reality to the instances themselves, to raw data, objects, and experience. Attracted to objects, wants to include them as much and as accurately as possible in all of its calculations, inclusive data over theory. The Socionics definition would be energizing, the attitude of breadth, ravenously accumulating more and more information. An energizer takes the initiative, putting more impetus into projects, instigating new action, taking them into big leaps, and driving events forward, making larger but less coherent changes to their surroundings, associated with action, expression, innovation, and improvement. So if we're looking at a cognitive function, let's just say T, for example, it will want to, if it has extroverted, if it's extroverted, then it'll want to get as much outside knowledge as possible. Whereas the introverted function, it would be different. Introversion, the subjective inner world, or the interpretative orientation towards one's inner world, allowing the subject to influence the data. A focus on the observer's response to and perception of objects, emphasizes the existence of discrete categories. The one, whether intentionally or not, grants more weight in reality to its abstracted principles, categories, and interpretations. For this reason, tends to be exclusive. Preference always goes to the theory and not to any conflicting instances. This is a general theory. Integrate. This is the Socionics definition, by the way. Over here. Integrating the attitude of depth, refining information down to the most important parts. An integrator carefully reacts to the initiatives of others, consolidating and reconciling, making sense, removing what does not fit, checking quality, and maintaining what is good, associating with analysis, reflection, self-maintenance, and good conscience. So basically, for a cognitive function, let's go with TI here. Okay, if it's introverted, the reasoning is more subjective. It's going to be more subjective. This is a bad cognitive function to say subjective, though, because I already know that people will say this function is not subjective, it's objective, and that's why it's a bit controversial to say that it's a subjective function. It really depends on which model you're using, and there's a lot of models within Jungian Typology. So I might get in trouble for saying this is subjective, which I'm not really. I'm just trying to explain that the introverted functions are typically more subjective. So maybe a better example would be the feeling functions, because everyone agrees that introverted feeling is more subjective, right? Not that any function, I think it would be best to say not that any function is necessarily like strictly subjective or objective, which is going to sound confusing, but how I see it is each function focuses on a specific kind of information. And later on, for beginners, you'll see that how that works. Like, this function is different from this function, even though they're both feeling functions, simply because one's extroverted and one's introverted. But it can even be more than that. This is a tricky topic. This is tricky. I'm just gonna leave it at that. I don't know how to explain it just yet, because I know there are members within the community who will say this objective subjective thing isn't good. I've learned it as objective subjective, so I need to go back and research that more. For now, though, we'll just say that if a function, we're just going to go with this. If a function's introverted, it's typically more subjective because it's dealing with more subjective information. If a function's extroverted, it's typically more objective because it's dealing with information outside of itself. We'll leave it at that. So moving on. Role. Alright. A role is the job of a function. There are two kinds. Data role, which, by the way, that is a terminology I made up because I could say perception, judgment, the perception, judgment, dictomy. However, if I want to talk about both of them, I don't think there's a good vocabulary for that because, okay, I'm going to illustrate this for a second because I want to explain why I made a different vocabulary for this, right? So, this, because you've seen this in like Myers-Briggs, right, where it's 4 letters, and this, by the way, is talking about the first function within a type. I know for beginners that does not make sense yet. Just know that you have a dominant function that you use, and that dominant function, it goes back to here. Some functions are extroverted, some functions are introverted. Whichever your dominant function is going to be pointed out within the first letter. That's how the model was originally created. And then the letters got prioritized over the cognitive functions when Myers-Briggs became more popular. But anyway, so this is orientation, right? So, but then what do we call this? This. Because all I've heard it be called so far is perception and judgment. And that just seems weird. Like, why do we have a name for extroverted and introverted, and they both get called as the orientation of like a cognitive function, but we don't have the same kind of word for what role they play? Using special lingo that's been put aside for a specific purpose really helps to embody the concept that is trying to be expressed. In addition to that, anything is better than the mouthful extroversion, introversion, or judging, perceiving. And anything is better than the abstract EI or JP. Not that shorthand doesn't have its place, but it shouldn't be the name of a binary coin. We shouldn't name labels as if we're pitting two traits against each other, which is how we encourage misunderstandings such as intuitive bias. It's best to clarify that the traits are complementary opposites by naming what the traits have in common and have those traits categorized under that name. So that's why I created this name Dataful, because I feel like there should be a label there somewhere. I haven't seen an official terminology for it, so I just kind of made one myself. It just fits better in my mind. Anyway, the perception judgment dichotomy, aka binary coin, whether a function possesses data absorption, perception deals with data absorption. Hopefully I'm spelling this right. The nose right in front of me. Okay. And, okay, data assessment. Perception, data absorption. Judgment, data assessment. Perception, the empirical action of taking in or gathering data about objects. A focus on states of mind and body. How we focus our attention and access information using either sensing or intuiting. I know that's broken English, but I actually like using this word. The correct word would be intuition, but that's just boring. If the perception function is extroverted, it's open to gathering new perspectives. If the perception function is introverted, it's closed to gathering new perspectives. So Dave's superpowers, I don't know if he still goes by that whole name. Dave from Objective Personality would say a perception function that is introverted, or rather an observing function which is introverted. That's a good point I should make real quickly. That's one thing I like about Objective Personality. There's very good good terminology that's simple for beginners. So that's one thing I'm going to include here, is that perception basically means observation and judgment basically means decision making. Back to what I was saying. If the perception function is extroverted, it's open to gathering new perspectives. If the perceiving function is introverted, it's closed to gathering new perspectives. aka it's organizing information. In socionics, it's known as irrationality. Perception is known as irrationality, which you can argue isn't a very good term because it gives off the impression that if you leave your perception, you're irrational. So, but to each model their own. The attitude of what is, perceptions of things, whether physical or abstract. Irrational information is comprised of all that we perceive, what we see or imagine, telling us what is or could be done. An irrational person's primary reason for action is to pursue or satisfy desires and needs, and as such tend to be more free-spirited and impulsive. Judgment. The interpretative action of providing evaluation and decisions on the already known data. A focus on actions and emotions. How we make decisions and get organized using either thinking or feeling. If the judging function is extroverted, it's open to sharing new judgments. If the judging function is introverted, it's closed to sharing new judgments. In socionics, is known as rationality, information on what ought, judgments on things whether sentimental or systematic. Rational information is comprised of all our assessments, what we think or feel about things. A rational person's primary reason for action is to maintain or fulfill standards and ideals, and as such tend to be more reliable and conscientious. I hope that explains the difference between perception and judgment, and you got an idea about this whole data role section here. We'll move on. This one right here, there's a different type of role. You will see this in socionics. It's the temperament role. There are 4 temperament roles: introverted judgment, extroverted judgment, introvert perception, and extrovert perception. And for each, there are 2 functions that oppose each other because the functions represent 2 opposing approaches to accomplishing the same role. So what does that mean? Well, let's break it down here. We have, let me change the color. We have introverted judgment, so JI. Extroverted judgment, JE. Introverted perception, PI, and extroverted perception, PE. So, these are basically cognitive functions. Like, this is basically data role paired with orientation. Remember, this is the orientation, right? Orientation. And this is the data role, aka judgment and perception. These 2 combined together is temperament role. So, to go over quickly what each one of these mean, if you see an introverted judging function, it basically means if the judging function is introverted, it's closed to sharing new judgments. So it keeps its judgments private. So we'll write that real quickly. That's an oversimplification, by the way, but we'll keep it to that now. Private judgments. Personal, not personal. Subjective. You can even say subjective judgments. Although TI, that one's a tricky one, but we'll put it in there anyway, for the sake of simplicity. JE, extrovert judging, open judgments. That basically means that it doesn't keep its judgments private, and it's open to more different kinds of judgment. So more data assessment. It's open to different kinds of data assessments. Whereas with introvert judging, it's not as open and it has their own subjective data assessments. As for the perception functions, introverted perception, private or subjective, running out of space, observations, we'll say. Introverted perception is often the one that has its own worldview. I've heard Dave from Objective Personality say that, and I agree, at least to an extent, because I think, it all depends on definitions. How do you define a worldview? But I think that's a good way of thinking about it, because someone's worldview is private, and it's just their view of the world. You can think of it that way. Extroverted perception is open, don't use the word perception, is open observations. So that means it's open to gathering more observations, and it does not keep personal or subjective observations. It's not like a worldview. It's open to changing its views. So I think that's a good way to explain the temperament role. I feel like section this off real quick. Hold on. There, that should be better. Anyway, moving on.